Fans, we're back live once again on the Cheap Heat Productions podcast empire. My name is Jack Kilby, no gimmicks guy on the socials, and I'm very pleased today to have back again for another interview to discuss his latest work, a work that stood atop the bestsellers list for pro wrestling books for weeks and is now still strongly up there, and it is called The Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon. I know there was a lot of anticipation about this book, but welcoming to the show once again, Mr. Brian R. Solomon. Brian, thanks for coming on tonight.
My pleasure, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
I guess the logical question to start off with is, what initially sparked your interest in writing a biography about Gorilla Monsoon? You know, an iconic figure, especially for those of us of a certain vintage, so to speak. But what really made you determine that his story needed to be told in full?
Well, I guess the main reason was that it never had been told before, and he's such a crucial person in the history of what's now the most successful wrestling company on the planet and in the history of the industry. So I just thought it was kind of sad that his story had never been told. There never been a documentary, there'd never been a book, not even from WWE. And so I felt the time had come. It had been more than enough time. I mean, unfortunately, he's been gone now for 26 years. So it's important to keep these things alive and to, kind of let people know what his legacy was.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that, as you point out, the man not only had a crucial tenure as a great heel, but also in the office and broadcasting, which we'll talk about. Why do you think his story wasn't captured before?
You know, even his family was not really sure about that. I know at one point years ago when they were doing the A&E biographies, not the recent ones, but people that remember many years ago, they did a bunch. They did Andre the Giant. They did Stone Cold Steve Austin. This is like going back to the Attitude days. And they were going to do a Gorilla Monsoon one around that time, but Vince McMahon pulled the plug on the deal with A&E, and it never got made. So I don't know. I think some of it was that he was gone. You know, they did a book with Blassie, but they did that book while Blassie was alive. And I think if Gorilla had lived longer, they would have gotten around to something. But part of that is because he passed away.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked before about how you approached the process for researching Blood and Fire, but I understand with the Monsoon work, you had some really unprecedented access to family members family members, but also insiders, so to speak, that worked with Gorilla. How did you approach the research for this work?
Well, that was the game changer. I had involvement of the Morella family, Gorilla's widow, Maureen, who passed away in February, but she had been involved in the book, and his daughter, Valerie. And they were so helpful answering questions and being interviewed, and photography, which is a big bonus for the book. I've got 2 photo sections in the book, 60 plus photos. And, the research is the most important part. The writing almost comes second. I mean, obviously I take a lot of care in my writing, but the research is what really tells me what the story arc is going to be. So I start with doing a whole bunch of interviews of people that knew him and worked with him or had also followed his career, fans, all kinds of things, just to get a feel for what the story should be, and other kinds of research, newspaper research and ancestry research and stuff. And the story starts to crystallize, and that's when you start writing.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you walk us through his early life as a son of Italian immigrants and his achievements in collegiate wrestling up until the point that I believe he was an Olympic hopeful, correct?
He was. Yeah, he was, and I wanted to talk about his immigrant background. He was the son of Italian immigrants, and, his family came to America from Italy with his grandparents' generation in the early 20th century. And so That was important to me. I'm also the descendants of Italian immigrants, and so I wanted to tell that part of the story. His amateur career, obviously gets overshadowed by his professional career, but he was an amateur wrestling notable figure. He was known. He was first runner-up in the heavyweight unlimited class in 1959 in the NCAA championships. That's the thing. Like he was almost there in a lot of things. I think his biggest advantage was his size. So had Gorilla Monsoon been an average sized person, he might have just been an average amateur wrestler, but because he was so huge, 6'6", 350 pounds, that he was unstoppable. He went undefeated in his senior year, and I think he had maybe 2 or 3 losses his entire high school career, and college and high school, same situation. He was a standby for the AAU team. They traveled the world wrestling. He was going to be a standby to the Pan American Games, and that would have possibly led him to the Olympics. But he stepped away at that point because he really needed to work and he needed money, and he was getting frustrated a little bit by the plight of an amateur wrestler. There's not a lot of potential upside financially in that world, and I was getting discouraged by the fact that he wasn't quite the best. It was like he was almost the best. And he was starting to get frustrated by that. And he had gotten married very young, and he needed to get out there and start earning money. So there was a little period from about late 59 into early 60 where he was really trying to just be a normal working guy. And then wrestling started calling,
Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about how he made that transition to a professional career first. But a Canadian fan, sent in a question about they put over the book, really enjoyed it, and asked how it came about that, of course, our national hero Bret the Hitman Hart wrote the foreword, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Gino was always a big proponent of Bret's, given his relationship with Stu, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So Calgary Stampede, that was where Gorilla Monsoon, back when he was wrestling as Gino Morella, that's where he got his first full-time break as a professional wrestler. He had been wrestling a little bit in upstate New York, a little bit in the Toronto, Montreal area, and part-time stuff on the weekends, that kind of thing. And then when they recommended that he go wrestle for Stu Hart, that was a full-time commitment. You're traveling 3,000 miles. You're committed there for 6 months. You're a wrestler. You know what I mean? And so like the Stu Hart promotion really got him on his feet. And this would be like 1961. He was very loyal to the Hart family. And so when Bret came to work for the company in 84, they had met briefly before that, and when he was wrestling, when Gorilla was wrestling there, Bret was like a very little kid. So he was very much a backer of Bret Hart, always. And so I just thought that Bret would be a great choice to write this forward. As a lot of people know, Gorilla Monsoon gave him the nickname, the excellence of execution. He was always pushing for him behind the scenes. And you could tell, I think, by the forward that Bret wrote, the fondness and mutual respect that they had.
In terms of his early influences breaking in, or professional wrestling mentors in that early stage, who would you delineate as falling into that category?
Mentors for him?
For Gorilla, yeah.
Well, I would say there's Pedro Martinez, who was the promoter in upstate New York, Western New York, like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. He was the first one to hire him as a pro wrestler. And there was also his booker, Sandor Kovacs, who was like a wrestling trainer. And he really broke Bob Morella into the business, taught him how to work, that kind of thing. Frank Tunney in Toronto was somebody that he always mentioned as a major influence, because he was the one that really started giving him a clue as to how much money you could make in wrestling. And he brought him in. I would say, obviously, Vince McMahon Sr., who gave him his name, Gorilla Monsoon, and made him into a main event superstar. There was Killer Kowalski, who made the introduction. Killer Kowalski, they met in Japan, and he had already been one of the biggest stars in wrestling for years, and Gorilla was a rookie, Bob Morella, Gino Morella, and Kowalski helped to make the introduction to McMahon. So, I mean, those were all people that were very influential in his early career, I would say.
You describe him as one of the prototype monster rampaging heels. He sold out Madison Square Garden. What made his character as a heel so effective, and how did it evolve over time?
Yeah, so he'd been a babyface for most of his short career. Before then, he'd been kind of an Italian-American babyface, like there were a lot in wrestling. And, it was a problem because, especially early on, because he was so big, with baby faces, they tend to be underdogs. They have to be in peril. You have to be pulling for them. And when you got a guy that's 6'6" and creeping up on 400 pounds, that guy's not the underdog. So it was tough. And not only that, they didn't need any Italian baby faces. They were full up in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. So what they needed were convincing challengers for Bruno Sammartino, who had just won the title a few months before that. And, they were not a member of the National Wrestling Alliance. They didn't have this steady stream of top talent at that time. They needed to make stars. They needed people they could work with. And he was somebody they could mold into what they wanted him to be. And, they had this whole character created for him where he was supposed to be this mute savage that Bobby Davis had found bathing in a river in Manchuria, just kind of living like a barbarian essentially. And so that was, back then when people, especially kids, when they really believed and they bought into it, he was a very scary individual. Like he described himself once saying that the fans really believed he was the devil incarnate. I mean, people were afraid of him in those early years.
You mentioned Bruno, and Monsoon had many high-profile matches with him. What insights did your research uncover about their rivalry and personal relationship?
Well, one thing that I uncovered was that, and this I think had never been really reported, is that Gorilla Monsoon was the most frequent challenger to Bruno Sammartino's World Championship ever, and that's combining his two reigns together. Between 1963 and 1969, he challenged Bruno for the title hundreds of times. And if you include tag team matches, he was also just the most frequent opponent of any kind throughout Bruno Sammartino's entire career. A lot of people had said it was Waldo von Erich. Waldo von Erich is close. He's a close second. And if you combine all singles matches, including non-title, he's the most frequent singles opponent for Bruno. Not the most frequent world title challenger and not the most frequent opponent. Also, they had 7 main events at Madison Square Garden, including a 70-minute draw that both men called the greatest match of their career. Their first match was Roosevelt Stadium in New Jersey in October 1963, and that was really the match that put Gorilla on the map as a major threat and a big star in wrestling, just basically coming out of nowhere almost overnight. And so I think Gorilla was always grateful for that, by choosing to work with him and to continue to work with him, that he had shown him great respect. He had made his career. He had made his livelihood. By 1960, by the mid 60s, he was considered a made man already. They knew he was going to be doing big things. And then by 1969, he was part owner of the company. So I think Gino never forgot that. He was very grateful and loyal to Bruno. They both broke into the business around the same time, but Bruno became a major star a little bit quicker than Gorilla. So he had the leverage. And Gorilla never forgot that. He always appreciated that.
Beyond the ring, Monsoon became a pivotal figure in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and WWF. How did he rise to become a part owner and a potential successor to Vince Sr.?
Well, he stood out in those days. He had a college education. He was very smart. He understood the business. He understood business and money. He was not a carny guy. He was not a shady kind of guy. He wasn't, You know, he wasn't a backstabber. He was trustworthy. Everybody liked and respected him. And also, he had really put down roots in that area. He bought a house in New Jersey in 1967, and they basically stayed in New Jersey, he and his family, for the rest of his life. And so they knew he wasn't going anywhere. So by 1969, Toots Mondt, who had been the 50% owner of the Capital Wrestling Corporation, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, he was looking to retire. He was in his 70s, wanted to go back home to St. Louis with his wife. And so the thinking was, you know, who are we going to sell this 50% to? It was originally going to be Bruno. You know, he was the top star. They were going to make him that 50% owner. He didn't want it for a lot of reasons. He did not want to do business with Vince McMahon Sr. You know, they were not the best of friends. They made a lot of money for each other, but they were not the best of friends. And so at that point, the decision was made to split up the shares, the 50%. So half of that went to Phil Zacco, who was a Pennsylvania promoter who had been the treasurer for the company and was very loyal to them for years, going back to the 50s. And the other 50%, the other half of that 50% went to Gino. So by the age of 32 in 1969, he owned 1/4 of the most lucrative professional wrestling company in the business.
Yeah, quite a meteoric deal.
Yeah.
Another fan question. We're jumping ahead in the timeline quite a bit here, but a fan wanted to know your thoughts in particular on that angle that took Monsoon off television with Vader. It's kind of been the subject of a lot of armchair quarterbacking over the years in terms of how it was executed. What are your thoughts?
Well, it was something that was very special because he didn't do that for anybody. I mean, no one put their hands on Gorilla Monsoon. It was a very rare thing. There had been like 1 or 2 brief incidents in the past, 15 years after Gorilla retired from wrestling. So it was a very rare thing. And Gorilla saw in Vader somebody who was almost like his modern day counterpart. They were similar in size, similar in body type. They were similar in working style because they both had the reputation of being the big guy that was agile and that could move and that wasn't just a lumbering guy. And so, Vader had come in. We look back on it now. That's the armchair quarterback. And we look back on it now. Vader was a bust in the WWF, unfortunately. He didn't live up to what we wanted coming off that amazing early 90s run in WCW. Everybody thought, he's going to do the same thing in the WWF. I know I did. Mm-hmm. And it didn't happen for a variety of reasons, health-related, political reasons, attitude problems, but it was not for lack of trying. They were really trying to put him on the map. It was kind of interesting because just like Bruno was in that position as a new champion in desperate need of threats, that's where Shawn Michaels was, or was going to be. I mean, Brett was still the champ, but they knew where they were going with it. And they needed these monster threats for the smaller Shawn. And I think that's what they thought Vader could be. And, it's a shame because Gorilla never did that for anybody. And he did that. And, in the end, it's easy to look back on it and go, well, that was for nothing. But that's not the way they looked at it at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the behind the scenes operations of the WWF, how did his influence shape the company's direction during the formative years when he became, office?
It's hard to overstate it. He was the man on the ground. Vince McMahon Sr. and Jr. had very different styles. Vince Jr., as we know, micromanager, control freak, has to be on top of everything, every move everybody makes. Vince Sr. was not like that. The way he operated was he hired people, competent people that he trusted to do their jobs, and then he let them do their jobs. He had no interest in doing everyone's job. So, like, for example, at Madison Square Garden, he would sit in his office backstage and hold court. He'd make his phone calls. He'd talk to the doctors. He would have meetings with wrestlers, whoever needed his time, the press. He was not out there calling finishes and sitting by the curtain. That was Gorilla's job. Gorilla was the boots on the ground. And when it came to the major shows like The Garden, and maybe even more importantly, when it came to TV tapings, he was what today we would call the TV producer or the showrunner, stage manager, whatever you want to call it. He made sure everyone had their finishes. He made sure everyone hit their spots. He made sure everything was timed perfectly. He gave the feedback, positive and negative, to everyone on the card. He ran the show. So it's hard to overstate that. From about through the entirety of the 1970s into the early 80s, that was his role. So again, you just can't, his hands were over everything. Not to mention he was involved in booking. It's hard to talk about the booker in that territory because it was a much more simple territory than a lot of other places. If you watch the weekly TV, there wasn't a ton happening. There would be a handful of major angles each year, basically. And that was Vince Sr. with some help from Gorilla. And anything that was top level main event, it would also be Bruno involved in that because he had direct say in his own challengers and things like that. But Gorilla had a piece of that. He had a piece of everything. So his fingerprints are all over the thing.
You know, as again, fans of a certain vintage can really remember Gorilla Monsoon's voice. You know, such a beloved television commentator and obviously intelligent, quite a loquacious individual, to say the least, or borrow one of his terms. What really made his broadcasting style so memorable? And would you, if you had to boil it down, and this is probably an apples to oranges argument, but would you say his most, I guess, entertaining broadcast partner would that either be the Brain or Jesse Ventura, or is it impossible to you know, break down the chemistry being different between each team?
Well, I'd say what makes his style stand out is that he tried to call it like a sport. And so there would be positive and negative. He would call out things that wrestlers did from a kayfabe point of view, but he'd call out things that they did wrong, just like a baseball announcer calling out a bad play. I mean, that's the way he thought about it. Not everybody appreciated that, but I think he won the respect and trust of fans. He was a trusted voice, and that's what made him, I think, stand out so much, and why he was so loved by young fans. It's like he was somebody they could believe in. You know, he was on the side of the good guys, but it wasn't over the top. He just seemed like a regular guy. Like, he wasn't cheerleading like, let's say, Vince McMahon would do. It was more like just a regular common sense guy who was sitting there. He wasn't a character. He was sitting there at ringside going like, that's not fair what that guy did. You know what I mean? Like, that's just a shortcut. You shouldn't do that. And it didn't seem like he was over the top. Now, but Bobby and Jesse, I mean, both incredible teams for different reasons. As a kid, I preferred Bobby and Jesse. As an adult, as a kid, I preferred Gorilla and Jesse. As an adult, I prefer Gorilla and Bobby. So Gorilla and Jesse were more like, again, like a sports call. Jesse was on the side of the heels, but again, it wasn't over the top. They would agree with each other a lot. They would concede points to each other. And they gave you the impression of two pros that had been in the ring and were calling it the way they saw it. They had different philosophies, but that was okay. And they respected each other. They would never, like, you never saw Gorilla like humiliating Jesse, or Jesse kowtowing to Gorilla like the Bobby team would be. That was very different. That was comedy. They were trying to accomplish something very different there. And I appreciate the comedy more now as an adult. They were wrestling's first comedy team. I defy anybody to come up with one before that, especially on commentary. They were a true comedy team. They had great timing. They were very entertaining. And so a lot of times when they were on the call, for better or worse, it became on occasion more about them than about the match, their interactions and things. But it was so good that I don't think anybody minded. So they're both great for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Another fan question with respect to the relationship that that Gorilla had during the time frame that Vince Jr. Took over, and went in the direction that he did, where he eschewed the territory system, and basically, we've all read about how Senior wouldn't have, completely, in the mythology, sold out to Vince Jr. had he known that he was going to take that approach. Was there ever any tension, I guess they're asking, between Gorilla and Vince, especially when he first started to run with his national expansion plan?
There absolutely was, and that's one of the things I think that I dissect in detail in the book that's never been talked about before. But you talk to anybody in the business that was around them and that's around now, they'll tell you that. I mean, he was not a happy camper. Well, that deal first came on in June of '82. The full ownership was transferred in July of '83, where all the payments were finished up. And so even at that point, you got to remember, it's a while before this thing really, truly takes off and proves itself, a year to 2 years. And at that point, Vince McMahon Jr. did not have a great reputation in the business. Not that he had some awful reputation. He wasn't somebody that had the respect of the other promoters. He was an unproven commodity. He'd screwed up on a lot of things. He was not considered a great business guy. He was the promoter's son. And that they don't always have the great respect of everybody. And so I think in the beginning, it was so unsure. You had someone like Gorilla Monsoon, who he had these shares in the company. He thought he was going to have them for life. He thought he'd be able to pass it along to his family. And he had been handpicked, and this is true, by Vince Sr. to be his successor. In fact, before Vince Jr. stepped in, Sr. was going to sell off his shares to the other partners, including Gorilla. There would be no new partners. And so there was some bitterness there. This was the son swooping in and changing Monsoon's destiny. He changed his destiny. And in the beginning, thinking this could all go down the drain, So they had to make him happy. They gave him such a great deal, but it was a potential deal. It was, okay, we're going to keep you on TV. You're going to get to be the commentator. And we're going to give you this sweetheart deal where you're going to get paid. He insisted he wanted 1.5 times opening match money for every show the WWF put on, whether he was at the show or not. Still, if the company doesn't succeed, that's going to amount to a whole lot of nothing. So you're holding your breath, you're rolling the dice. Now, eventually, when it was demonstrated that this was all going to work, his mood changed. I don't think they were ever like the greatest of friends. They certainly liked and respected each other, but they were business partners. They had been rivals. It was not quite as the familial kind of relationship that Vince would have with people like Fred Blassie and even Arnold Skoland. It was much more like they were colleagues. Like Gorilla was more of a threat to Vince. Yeah, you have to think of it that way. He was a rival. Those other guys were never going to cause problems. Gorilla could have caused problems. And so, like Vince himself said in the Netflix documentary, he said it himself. He said, when I started working for my dad, Gorilla Monsoon was there, and he considered me to be a competitor. And boy, was he right. Those were the words of Vince McMahon in the documentary. That tells you all you need to know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When we think about during that golden era of wrestling, Monsoon was on, so many of the iconic calls, and including the WrestleManias, where the title comes from, Hogan versus Andre, Irresistible Force, meaning the immovable object. His call over Steamboat and Savage at WrestleMania 3. Really regarded as a masterclass in emotional storytelling. I'm not sure what your opinion is per se of the modern commentary style, but is it your view that level of, as you've pointed out previously, the storytelling aspect that he was so adept at, that added so much to the presentation? Do you think we're missing the boat in the modern era by not emulating more of that, or is the business just changed this rapid fire deal where that really wouldn't be as possible now?
Well, the commentators today have to do so much more than back then. They have to sell so many more things. You talk to guys who do it today, and there's a lot of great ones. Michael Cole, Kevin Kelly, those kind of guys. Jim Ross still doing it. I mean, you've got to push there's all these plates you're spinning at the same time. And those older guys, they didn't have to do that as much. So I got to give the newer guys credit. But the problem, I think, becomes they do the opposite, let's say, of what Gorilla used to do, where they become seen more as just shilling for everything. Like everything is the greatest thing ever. Every match is the greatest. Every show is the greatest. Every wrestler is the greatest. And you start to erode, I think, the trust of the fans. They just see you as a salesman. Make no mistake about it. The greats of the past, Gordon Solie, Gorilla Monsoon, Lance Russell, they were salesmen too. But they made you believe more. They didn't make it as obvious that you felt like they were on your side. They were fans like you, that kind of thing. They were serious sportscasters. So that's something that's been lost. I think another thing is overproducing these guys. Like, again, you look at Michael Cole, I think he's gotten significantly better since Vince left the company because he doesn't have, presumably, someone screaming and yelling in his ear through the whole show. Now, those old guys were not overproduced. They were allowed to do their job. I'm not saying they never got constructive advice. You know, Gordon Solie certainly was talking to Eddie Graham and talking to Jim Barnett and those people about what they want him to get across. But they let him do his job. Lance Russell, they let him do his job. Gorilla Monsoon, the same thing. Vince was not going to be yelling in Gorilla Monsoon's ear because if he did, Gorilla Monsoon would go home. And to be honest, he'd still be making all that money, whether he was there or not. So they let him do things that later announcers would not be allowed to do, and I think to their detriment. So I think that's the reason why those old announcers of the past are so beloved.
Yeah, this is a bit of a side note, but I know I wanted to ask you in terms of that element of the TV product, the commentary and the salesmanship. I know Brian Last of the Arcadian Vanguard family is really big on Cowboy Bill Watts and his style on the Mid-South television. Are you a fan of his approach as well?
Of Bill Watts?
Yeah, on commentary.
Yeah, and I agree with Brian on that because what Watts did, and it's because it was his baby. What he did was he helped the fan so completely understand the storylines and the feuds, and he added dimension to them by explaining things in such a helpful way. He trained the viewer on how to feel about everything, whether they realized it or not, and he would shape it. And, you know, a lot of the other great commentators did that too, but Watts did it so well because it was his thing. He was running it. He was booking it with Grizzly Smith. He was the promoter. He knew what he wanted to get across. Another guy who would do that for the same reason was Vince McMahon, but Bill Watts did it better, in my opinion. I mean, I know a lot of people love Vince, and Vince, I like the earlier Vince when he's still just the announcer because he's doing that Howard Cosell thing, and to me, he comes across better. Later on, he really is just way too much of a salesman for me, way too much of just a shameless cheerleader, and you know, he's just hammering things home in what I find to be a very I don't know, just too on the nose, I guess. I don't know the best way I could describe it. Whereas Watts had a way of doing it like you could watch the Mid-South and not even know that Bill Watts was the boss. You know what I mean? And I know there's a lot of people that didn't know Vince was the boss either, but Vince was, you look back on it now and you could tell he's the boss. Whereas with Watts, to me at least, it wasn't as obvious, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Back to Gorilla, one of the hallmarks of his approach to calling the action was his extensive vocabulary. I remember as a kid actually going, "Wow, those are some very, very extensive words." And he was a very smart individual. But was that something that he, I guess, incorporated as part of his shtick, or was that just who the man was and his his grasp of the language. I just always wondered if anybody producing or otherwise would think, boy, you're going to alienate some people with the 15 letter words, etc.
No, he was a well-educated man. He was a well-read man, and he didn't, that's who he was. I talked to his family, and they said he spoke that way in his everyday life. All those expressions, the cliches, that's how he talked. He was just being himself. Now, I also learned that when he was in college, he minored in biology. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine he was learning a lot of those anatomical terms that would stick with him and that he would remember and pull out of his back pocket. But the thing that changed, and a lot of people noted this, is, once his son died in 94, that's when things changed. So he could still turn it on when he needed to become Gorilla Monsoon, but he was no longer the same person away from the cameras and away from the microphone, whereas it used to be just the same guy. He was just being himself. Then it became more of like a persona that he took on, and away from the ring, he was kind of just a shadow of himself.
Yes, that was Joey Morella, who it was a car accident, correct?
Yeah, on the New Jersey Turnpike, July 4th, 1994. He and Bruno Lauer, Harvey Whippleman, were in the car together, and they both fell asleep. They were coming off a 17-day run of house shows and TV tapings without a break. They were driving through the middle of the night to get back to their airport, and they both fell asleep at the wheel and went off the median.
Terrible tragedy. Your book includes rare photos and a detailed career timeline. What were some of the lesser known anecdotes that you discovered about Monsoon's life?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, the book is just full of them. There were things that happened to him in Puerto Rico, how the fans would attack him. There's a story in the book about a fan on the roof of the locker room dropping a cinder block on his head when he stuck his head out the door to see if it was safe to leave, and him needing to be rushed to the hospital for stitches. I mean, there's all those kinds of little stories in there, and just how he also, all the wrestlers that he mentored. Like, there's a story about Jimmy Valiant coming into the territory for the first time, and it was Gorilla who took him under his wing and found him a place to live, and that sort of thing. And, it's like he's planting these seeds throughout the business so that even though he didn't travel all that much outside the Northeast throughout most of his career, because he made such a positive impact on so many people who came through the territory, then those people would go to other places. The word really spread throughout the industry that this was really one of the most stand-up, respected guys by anyone in the business. Even didn't matter where you went, it was known that this was a man of importance and respect, and a man to be admired.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, another fan question that was sent in predictably when we're talking about Gorilla Monsoon, even the casual fans have a familiarity with that term, gorilla position. When they're asking, when did it take on that you mentioned he was there and he was doing the producing, etc. But when did it take on that specific nomenclature?
It's hard to pinpoint. A lot of people ask me that. There's no moment, obviously. Those are the kind of things, as we all know, like those kind of things, just over time, it just sort of becomes a thing. There was no one incident where somebody said gorilla position. It's hard. And even if there was, we'll never know what it was because everyone's gone. And, I just know that, it wasn't known that immediately, but that position was being manned by him once he took over as part owner in 69. And right around that time, 69, 70 is when they launched their two new weekly programs, which was Championship Wrestling, and the other one was All-Star Wrestling. And one of them was out of eventually, Championship Wrestling started in Philadelphia and wound up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And All-Star Wrestling was the one in Hamburg. And those shows started around that time. And, that's when he became so associated with that position that over the next, and he really filled that role consistently for at least a dozen or more years, 12 to 15 years. Once he started doing commentating, obviously he wasn't in Gorilla for every show because he'd be at ringside, but for all the shows, let me put it this way, any WWF show, even in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, if Gorilla's not on commentary, he's at the Gorilla position. He's doing that work still. And even when he was at ringside on headset, he would still be calling some of the shots in the back and relaying messages and things like that. So, I mean, it just became linked to him. It just, eventually in time permanently linked to him. And then what you see is, later on in the business, like maybe getting into the late 90s and stuff, when you start getting all these people now in other wrestling companies and on the indies and things, and everywhere you go now, that position is called the Gorilla position because of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very cool. You mentioned that Bret Hart was one of the wrestlers that he had a great affinity with. Does a name or names jump out in terms of Gorilla not having much time for? I've read or again anecdotally, etc., that he wasn't all that impressed with the Ultimate Warrior, but were there any other names that he had to, I guess, tolerate because of their status in the company, but he kind of did not get along with?
Well, there's the famously Bruiser Brody was on that list. Brody came through the company in the mid 70s. They did not get along. There's debates on how far it went and how bad it was, but they did not get along. And I think that's one of the big reasons that Brody never was brought back. I think Kevin Sullivan was there for a little bit as a mid-card guy in the 70s, and they never brought Kevin back. He was kind of a smallish guy, and I don't know if there was any kind of animosity there or anything. The Warrior, like you said, yes, I mean, he did not have a high opinion of the Warrior. To be honest with you, there were a lot of guys that he had a very high standard, both for in-ring work and for character outside the ring. Like he was one of those guys. Bobby Heenan was like that too, which I think is why they got along. If you were a lowlife, if you were a dirtbag, or if you did things he didn't approve of, you wouldn't be his favorite person. I mean, people asked me about Hulk Hogan when Hulk Hogan died. And sure, Gorilla knew what his job was, which was, this man is the cash cow. We've got to put him over to the moon. And Gorilla did that better than anybody other than maybe Vince. But away from the ring, I'm not saying that they didn't get along, but I don't think Hulk Hogan was one of his favorite people. And I think one of the reasons for that, I think part of it might have been the politicking, which Gorilla was never a fan of, and the drug culture. I mean, look, even though he never came out in opposition the way that Bruno did, the drug culture in the WWF was not something that he approved of at all. He was very straight-laced about those things, not even marijuana, nothing. He was from that generation. You could drink till the cows come home, but any kind of drug didn't matter. That would be, he'd be dead to him. And look, the drugs were everywhere in those days, and Hulk Hogan was at the top of the food chain of that. So I think those kind of things made him look sideways at a lot of these guys. Look, to be honest with you, Bret would be the first one to say it. He was a part of that scene too back then, but that didn't stop Gorilla from loving and supporting Bret. Maybe because he respected his work so much and he respected his family. Another one, actually, now that you mention it, Randy Savage, not one of his favorite people. Randy Savage didn't like the way he worked in the ring, didn't like to work with him as a commentator. He thought he was too headstrong. He didn't take advice. He didn't take criticism, and Gorilla didn't like that. I'm trying to think of even some wrestlers from his time of wrestling. There was Argentina Apollo, who was a big wrestler in the Northeast in the 60s, kind of like a Rocca knockoff. Gorilla was not a fan of that guy. But I mean, those stories are few and far between, though.
Mm-hmm. Have time for one more fan question, and I'd be very interested in your answer to this one. But they sent in a question about Tony Schiavone when he jumped from Crockett WCW to WWF. Did Monsoon have any? I guess what they're asking is, was he involved in any way in Tony not working out there, so to speak, or having the warmest sort of reception as it's been documented in the past?
No, actually, has that been said that people have said that Gorilla was one of the reasons why he didn't work out there? I've never heard that.
Well, it apparently, again, anecdotally, mythology, etc. He wasn't much of a fan of Shivani's kind of style and coming from the opposition. And just I have no basis in which to talk about that, but that's what the fan I think was alluding to. Maybe Mr. Shivani said that somewhere in the past.
I'll tell you what, there may have been people there who felt that way, but Tony has never had anything really but glowing things that I've heard to say about Gorilla. Tony was there from 89 to 90. He had a 1-year deal and he never renewed it. My understanding was that Gorilla was actually very happy to see Tony because he was at that point looking for somebody who could really step in and take over what he had been doing. And that's what they wanted Tony to be. Tony was supposed to become the next, number 2 announcer behind Vince, and or maybe even take over for Vince, because Vince knew he wasn't going to be able to do it forever. And part of what the main reason it didn't work out, and you could even hear from Tony, is that Tony did not. I know it sounds crazy to me that you would blow it based on this, but he hated living up north. He hated being in the Connecticut area. He wanted to go back home. He has also said that he immediately regretted doing that, that he went back because, see, to give a little background, Tony had originally left Crockett after Crockett was sold to Ted Turner. So when it was becoming WCW, when they were moving everything from the Carolinas to Atlanta, that Tony didn't want to be a part of that. He didn't want to work in Atlanta. He didn't want to work for the Turner organization. He also was kind of on a losing battle with Jim Ross. There was kind of like a political battle going on. Jim Ross wanting to be the top announcer, Tony being there before him. So Tony was on the losing side of that. So Vince brought him in. Now, Tony had a lot of the tools that they wanted, because the problem was Vince was stuck with either these grizzled old wrestling guys that were not the most camera friendly, they didn't have broadcast training, or he had professional broadcasters who looked great and were young, but they didn't know wrestling. Tony had both. He had the professional training. He had a sports background. He was young, and he'd been working in wrestling for years, and he got it at a high level. So they had high hopes for Tony. I think that, the big reason why it didn't work out was that he wanted to go back. And then what did he wind up doing? Working for the Turner organization in Atlanta, but Gorilla was looking for somebody to step in and take over. That's why also a couple of years later, ironically, when the worm had turned in WCW and now Shivani has more power and he's got Bischoff on his side and Jim Ross is feeling the push that they want him less and less on TV. Now Jim Ross goes to the WWF and Gorilla welcomed him with open arms more than anybody. Where you had people in the company that thought he was a mole, that thought they couldn't trust him. He was a Southern wrestling guy. Gorilla was on his side. And I don't think it was any different with Shivani. I'd be surprised. I'm not saying, it's impossible, but I'd be surprised to hear that Gorilla was an enemy of Shivani. I've never heard anything to that extent, in that tone.
Maybe they're conflating the early Jim Ross situation in general with Shivani, but thank you for that.
No, yeah, because JR was seen as an enemy by a lot of people when he came over. Randy Savage was not thrilled with him. Chief Jay Strongbow, Lord Alfred Hayes was not thrilled with him. And the guy on his side was Gorilla, and he helped kind of get him in good with that company.
Mm-hmm. Looking back, Brian, if you could boil it down to a couple of things, what do you believe Monsoon's enduring legacy in professional wrestling is, and how do you think it resonates with fans today, and not necessarily, again, those of us of a certain vintage, but the younger fans that may be discovering his work via YouTube and all the streaming platforms, etc.
Well, I think part of his legacy is this idea that you could be a genuinely decent, respectful, good person and succeed at a very high level in wrestling. People sometimes act like it's got to be one or the other, and you got to be a backstabber, you got to be a jerk, you got to be Machiavellian. And he's proof that you don't. That sometimes if you treat people the right way and simply are really good at your job and know what you're doing and get along with people, that you can be a major success. He's proof of that. The other part of it, like you said, as far as the fans will view him, I think it's interesting today that you probably have many fans who were too young to remember him, are not sure who he is, but they know his voice because his voice is everywhere still. Documentaries, historical packages, everywhere. They might go, "Oh, that's the guy. I know that voice. That's Gorilla Monsoon." You know what I mean? So I think it's like that's part of the legacy. He is the voice of a classic era of the WWF. Ironically, even more than Vince McMahon these days. That voice, that call of Gorilla Monsoon is probably more well known. Vince today, in wrestling terms, I mean, he's remembered for a lot of things, but in wrestling terms, Vince is remembered more as that heel character than anything else, than being the voice of the company, which is ironic because he did it so much longer than Gorilla. But that voice of Gorilla Monsoon, that is the voice of the classic WWF.
Fascinating stuff as usual. What's next for you in terms of, do you have any other wrestling works in the hopper, so to speak? I noticed a fan suggested that you should do something definitive on Vern Gagne, notwithstanding other folks tackling that subject. But what's in the future for all the fans that enjoy your work?
Well, I've got a few ideas I'm throwing around. I like the idea, like I did with Gorilla and the Sheik, of finding a book idea where I can write about the old school vintage stuff, but under an umbrella that's going to have a wider appeal. I'm not one of those writers, and there's plenty of them out there that do amazing work. I don't want to pick a very niche kind of obscure person, even though I'd love to. There's many people I'd love to write their story because I want to reach a wide audience. That's so important to me. So that's why I'm very selective about subjects. I know, like, I've thought about a few possibilities for biographies, but if I don't do a biography, I've had this idea floating around for a while that I think would be so cool, but it's expensive to produce. I want to do a coffee table book of wrestling magazines. So like, that classic era, mid to late 20th century, the heyday of wrestling magazines, and do it like an art book, like you see they do with comic books, and Playboy did one, like that kind of thing, where like it's an art book. So you could have, first of all, it's not as much writing. I like that, but you could have all the great covers, the great spreads, the blood, the apartment wrestling, all the different companies talk to people like Bill Apter and other people that are still with us, Tom Burke from Ring Wrestling and that kind of thing. So I'd love to do that, but I'm not sure. It may be another biography. I don't want to say who just yet, because I like to sit on those things in case somebody hears it and decides to do it before me. But I do have some ideas.
Awesome. Where can the fans pick up not only your Monsoon book, but Blood and Fire and your other works? And where is the best place for the fans also to keep up with you on the social media gimmicks?
Well, I will say all my books are available. You can get them on Amazon or wherever books are sold. They're widely distributed, thankfully. But on the front of Irresistible Force, I just want to say, in addition to that, I just got a new shipment in myself of the book. And so if people want a signed copy, I am selling those. And I encourage people that want one to do that as well. You can find me, on my email is brianrsolomon@yahoo.com, brianrsolomon@yahoo.com. Or you can find me on social media. So on Twitter and Instagram, it's Brian R. Solomon. And on Facebook, you can find me there. And there's also the Facebook group for my podcast. My podcast is Shut Up and Wrestle, and it has a Facebook group, and you can get me there. I'm very easy to get a hold of if people want a signed copy of the book.
Absolutely. I'll be one of the fans picking that one up. Want to thank you again. It's been a very interesting discussion. I think that your work is important because, again, you're taking the history of the business, which traditionally can be, less prominent or disappear in the sands of time, and you're really preserving it in an entertaining, accessible format. So looking forward to see what you have next.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Fans, that's it for this edition of the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. Thanks very much for watching. We'll catch you next time. Thank you for watching this video. Please give it a like if you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Cheap Heat Productions. Don't forget to hit the notification button and you won't miss any